Good afternoon, guys, and welcome back to the Suburban Proletarian. My name is Greg. My journey as a watch enthusiast has been a long one. I've owned, I don't know how many watches over the years. I've destroyed an awful lot of them. And over the years, my watch collection or my selection of watches has generally improved incrementally. I keep getting better and better watches, although I still enjoy a good quality cheap watch if I can find one. But as the quality and the commensurate cost of my watches has increased over that time, you become more and more sensitive to every little scratch and dent and ding. And I think if you're really into watches and you spend a lot of time thinking about watches, you sort of develop a sixth sense, a situational awareness to kind of subconsciously keep track of where your wrist is at all times. I mean, scratches happen, dents happen, dings happen, but every time your watch bangs into a door frame or scrapes against a cinder block wall, you have this, it's like fingernails on a chalkboard on your brain. And to avoid that, you kind of become hyper aware of where your wrist is all the time. And I've had a lot of questions over the last 18 months regarding the veracity of some of the claims I've made about different products. Generally, I go by the information that the manufacturer publishes as far as materials and construction. I don't really have any access to any equipment whatsoever for testing products. I can only go by my own experience and what the manufacturer tells me. But the other day when I was cleaning up some of my wife's watches, I realized that I do have access to one test platform, and I'll make some use of it today while the watches are available. And that test platform is my wife. My wife's always been a watch wearer. As long as I've known her, she's worn a watch. But she's not really into watches. She's not what you would call a watch enthusiast. She is a Russian, and she has very Russian practical sensibilities about things. She has a very distinctive style that she's developed for herself, and she knows what she likes as far as appearance. But to her, and she uses watches to accessorize her wardrobe, for instance. But to her, in reality, a watch is a tool to tell what time it is. And she hasn't developed the same sort of situational awareness about where her wrist is all the time. And if her watch scrapes against something or drags along a wall, I don't think she ever even really notices it. And she wears a watch every day, as I said. She works in an industrial manufacturing environment, running big industrial looms. So she's working around large machinery all the time. She has to reach inside sometimes to make adjustments. And her watches get more worn in an incredibly short period of time than mine do in years of wear. And that brings me to a question which has been hotly debated recently, and that is regarding materials used to make watch crystals. And I have a couple of my wife's watches here, and I'd like to take a look at them. Sapphire versus glass versus acrylic. Well, the watch that has the acrylic crystal in it is not my wife's, it's mine. And so I want to take a quick look at these three watches, and I think they will provide pretty telling insight into the properties of the three most common watch crystal materials. Again, that's acrylic, hardened mineral glass, and sapphire. So let's take a look. All right, so here are the three watches in question. I'm going to go from left to right. The one on the left is my old Seiko 5, and these two watches belong to my wife. None of these watches is new, obviously. They've all got a significant amount of wear, and they represent the three most common types of crystal material. Of course, acrylic, hardened mineral glass, and all the way over here on the right we have a watch with a sapphire crystal. So starting over here, this is my old Seiko 5, This watch dates from about 1986, I believe. As far as I know, it's never been serviced. It still runs and keeps time very nicely. All you got to do is pick it up and give it a shake, and you're in business. But this was a base model. This was about as basic an automatic watch as you could get from Seiko in those days. And as such, it's got an acrylic crystal on it. So this watch has seen quite a bit of use. But as you can see, the crystal is in almost perfect condition. The reason for that, there's a few chips and gouges. I don't know if they're going to show up very well on the camera. But the reason that the crystal's in such good condition is, although acrylic is quite soft and it does scratch rather readily, you can polish a plastic crystal, an acrylic crystal, very easily using things like toothpaste. Sometimes if you've got a really heavy scratch, you can use some 2000 grit, wet or dry sandpaper, the type of very fine sandpaper they use for polishing automotive paint. And then you use some sort of polishing paste or toothpaste to get it really shined up. And as you can see, this crystal's taken a lot of wear, but it still looks very good, and it hasn't cracked. And really, although acrylic does require more work than glass, and it was considered lower down the scale than glass in the 1980s, it can be very, very serviceable. And there, of course, there is still some really high-end watches, like the Omega Moon watch, which still uses an acrylic, or as they like to call it, Hesselite crystal. And it can be very serviceable. It'll take hard knocks, and when it scratches, you can polish it out. So, although people in general, and I certainly fell in that camp, kind of looked down on plastic crystals back in the day, I've gotten a lot more respect for them, and I definitely wouldn't see an acrylic crystal as being a problem. If I was considering buying a new watch today, I would absolutely buy a watch with an acrylic crystal. So there's that. Now we get to the first of my wife's watches, and this is a Bulova, and it's not what I would have picked, but my wife purchased this watch herself. As I said, she has her own style. She loved this watch. I think she still loves it, although it needs a new battery, and you can see she's not been wearing it in a while. But Bulova is a great old brand, been around for a long time, an old line American manufacturer, and even today they still produce some pretty cool watches. The Lunar Pilot is a good example, very popular today. I think there's some question about the actual historical significance of the Lunar Pilot, but it's a very cool watch, one that I would love to get my hands on to do a review of. It has one of Bulova's super accurate precisionist movements in it, and it's pretty cool. This is not one of the high points of Bulova's manufacturing history. As you can see, it's not stainless steel. It doesn't have a stainless steel bracelet. It doesn't have a stainless steel case. It's some sort of chrome-plated base metal. It doesn't have a screw-down back. It's got a pop-off back. But this is very indicative of a watch that my wife wore every single day. Look at the side of this case here. It almost seems to have a hammered finish to it. But it didn't have a hammered finish when she bought it. This was a very glossy, high-polished chrome finish, which looked like a stainless steel case. You can see some of the finish has worn off there. But my wife, as I said, she hammers watches. And this watch is no exception to the rule. A lot of the finish is worn off the offside of her wrist here, where the bracelet has dragged against stuff. And the crystal has taken a heck of a beating. I don't know if you're going to be able to see all of the tiny little scratches, But there is one enormous gouge right across here. My wife has no idea how she did that. And she asked me if I could polish the crystal for her, like I do with my acrylic Seiko crystal. And I know that glass can be polished. I'm not adept at doing that. And this is a significant gouge. I mean, you can feel this with your fingernail. I would have maybe, if this was a better watch, looked into getting the crystal replaced. But actually, it's a domed crystal on only one axis. It's sort of semi-cylindrical. I don't even know where you would get a crystal to replace this. And this watch has taken a lot of abuse. You can see it, and the crystal is pretty much shot. And I imagine she'll probably ask me to put a new battery in it eventually, but she hasn't been wearing it very much recently. But this is why I don't really care for for glass crystals. I'm assuming that this is a hardened mineral glass, similar to Seiko's Hardlex crystal, but it just doesn't measure up in my opinion. So now we move on to the third watch. I bought her this watch back in just before Christmas, so early December maybe. So we're looking at like 7 or 8 months. And as you can see, it's a Calvin Klein, which is a fashion brand to be sure. But unlike so many of the other fashion brands like Michael Kors and sort of junk like that, Calvin Klein is actually a member of the Swatch Group. So this watch is manufactured, it is Swiss made, and it's made by the same people who produce Certina and Rado and Omega and Blancpain. Certainly it's not in that class, but I decided, why don't I get a Calvin Klein watch? I was really interested to see what sort of the very base level of the Swatch pyramid was like, and actually it's quite a nice watch. It is all stainless steel. Again, it has a press-on back, but it's got 50 meters of water resistance. It has sort of that vaguely Rolex Datejust styling with the fluted bezel ring. Solid link construction to the bracelet, a nice clasp, which is just about up there with some of the Certina and Rado watches I've seen. But you can see in just 7 or 8 months the enormous amount of wear on the bracelet. Again, I said my wife really looks at watches as being tools, and she wears a watch every day. She wears this watch every day, and she works in a manufacturing environment around heavy machinery with her hands, and her stuff gets beat up. I have watches that have a similar amount of wear on the bracelet and case after maybe 20 years of wear, certainly not after 7 or 8 months. But what we're here to look at is watch crystals, and again, this has a sapphire crystal, and you probably aren't really going to be able to make it out on camera. This lighting is kind of difficult, but there is not even one tiny, tiny little scratch on this crystal. It is exactly as it looked when I took it out of the box for the first time. I mean, it is perfectly shiny. I've looked at this under a loupe. There aren't even any tiny little micro scratches. And you can see from the condition of the rest of the watch, it hasn't been babied. This is not a replacement crystal. This is as true a testament as I can find, or as I can think of, to the really, really hard-wearing nature of sapphire. I was a bit skeptical, particularly with some of the cheaper watches early on. I thought, well, is it really the same kind of sapphire that you get in a Rolex or an Omega? But I think this is a pretty clear illustration that sapphire is pretty much the way to go. There is some indication that it's less impact resistant than glass, but this watch has certainly taken some hard knocks. You've seen the kind of gouging my wife managed to inflict upon this hardened glass crystal, this enormous gouge across here. I just don't see any comparison whatsoever. So it's kind of an unscientific test, but that's my assessment of the three various types of watch crystal. I really wouldn't care if I never got another mineral glass crystal again. I still like acrylic. It's very impact resistant, it wears reasonably well, and it's very easy to polish. And I mean, sapphire, there's a reason that most of the most expensive watches in the world have sapphire crystals. So I don't know that I really have much else to contribute, so let's wrap this up. And so, to sum this video up, if I haven't already made it perfectly clear, my preference when it comes to, or the sort of my hierarchy of preferences when it comes to watch crystal materials would be sapphire, then acrylic, and mineral glass, probably a distant third. I grew up in a time when almost all watch crystals were made from acrylic. Hardened mineral glass was sort of the premium upgrade, and I was a fan of mineral glass crystals for a long time. But with the proliferation of cheap, readily available sapphire, I just don't see mineral glass as being a viable option anymore. While it is more impact resistant than sapphire, it's much less scratch resistant by a long shot. And while it's more scratch resistant than acrylic, it's nowhere near as impact resistant as acrylic. And when acrylic does get scratched, you can polish it very, very easily. You've seen my 30-something-year-old Seiko 5, which I've polished on numerous occasions, and it still looks, there's a couple of deep gouges in it that I haven't been able to polish out, or I don't want to remove so much material that would be necessary to completely polish them out. But I mean, the crystal is still perfectly clear, and the face is very visible, and it's not hard to keep it in that state. So on cheaper watches, or I guess some more vintage watches, I really prefer acrylic over everything else. And for higher end watches, and even some pretty affordable Chinese clones that have come out recently, sapphire is just the way to go. It's plenty impact resistant enough, particularly if you take care of your watches and you're kind of aware of where your watch is most of the time. And it's very cheap, and it absolutely doesn't scratch. So anyway, I hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope you found it helpful, perhaps. It is an opinion piece, but I think my opinions are pretty well reasoned. If you did enjoy it, please consider subscribing. You can always share my videos, tell your friends. If you do subscribe, or if you're already a subscriber, click the little bell icon down below, or I guess actually it's down here. That will allow YouTube to send you notifications when I post new content to the channel. And when I do that, I hope to see each of you here at that time. Later, guys.